Welcome to Facebook Live. It's Friday, and every week at this time we like to do a little bit of a check-in. Today's topic is about marathoners and how to stay healthy. We picked this topic because we're coming into heavy marathon season. We've got Lakefront, we've got actually Ironman Wisconsin coming up. So it's a great time to kind of talk about staying healthy as you're finishing your training and really coming into those big events that you've been training all year for. There are some obvious things that a lot of people talk about. Number one would be training appropriately and making sure that you're doing the proper progressions for your season. If you've had a rough season or weather has inhibited your training, you want to make sure that you're not jumping into the actual event without doing the proper progressions leading into it. You also want to make sure that you're using adequate recovery, diet, nutrition. Check out our Facebook Live from last week for a little bit of an overview over that. We'll have more coming up in upcoming weeks. The biggie that I want to focus on today is a little bit of that taper coming into your event and why that's important, as well as your warm-up and cool-down that we want to focus on for the event itself, but also for training. When we talk about taper, the amount of time that you taper and how heavily you taper is going to depend on the event itself. So as a general recommendation, you're usually looking somewhere between a week to 2 weeks of taper, meaning that you're reducing how much of the actual event or sport that you're doing. So for marathoning, you're going to reduce your running. For Ironman, you're going to be reducing your biking, swimming, running. And the big thing is that you still want to stay active during this time. So you may not be running during your taper, but you might still be doing biking or walking or other activities. You want to keep your tissues healthy and mobile. You just don't want to put the additional strain on them right before the event. For longer events, you use a longer taper. So for something like Ironman Wisconsin or Ironman in general, you may be looking at about a 2-week taper. For something shorter, like a 5K run or a 10K run, you might only be looking at a few days or a week. So it's going to depend on the type of event that you're doing. For more specifics, feel free to contact our office and we can get you some specific timelines for different types of events, but that's going to change depending on the event and the person. Now when we talk about warm-up and cool-down, warm-up and cool-down are incredibly important to get your tissues ready for the activity and then also to help with recovery and making sure that your tissues kind of get that toned down after an event or after a practice or a run or something coming into your event. We want to talk a little bit about stretching today as part of that warm-up or part of that cool-down. Stretching itself, where you get into a position and you just hold it for a minute, 2 minutes, 30 seconds, there's different theories out there about how long to hold, has actually been found to be somewhat detrimental to the tissues. Yes, you give the tissues length, but you also kind of tune them down neurologically, meaning that they can't contract as quickly or as powerfully as they need to. So we don't actually want to stretch before we go out for an event, and those effects have been found to last 24 to 48 hours following stretching. So we also don't like to do that right after, let's say, a run if you're going to be running tomorrow or the next day. There are better ways to get that tissue mobile and help it recover. And one way that we use that is we use what we call dynamic stretching or dynamic movements. This isn't bouncing, this isn't getting into a position and bobbing up and down in it, but it's getting into a position that you would have to use and then coming back out. So for hamstring example, showing you seated, if I put my leg out in front of me, traditionally I would stretch by kind of bending into that position and holding it. Instead of doing that, we can kind of mobilize or dynamically use that tissue. So very gently, very slowly, I'm going to keep my leg straight, make sure that I hinge from my hip, not from my spine, so I'm not curling through my spine, but I'm kind of leaning forward from my hip. I can get into the position so that that tissue has to stretch, and then I can back off. And then I can go back into that position and do it 8 or 10 times, and then back off. That gets that tissue ready if I'm going to go for a run to be able to extend and relax without holding the position and getting those neurological effects that we found can be detrimental. So number one, we don't want to stretch right before an event or right before a race or right before a practice. We also don't want to use stretching after an event, race, practice if we're going to be doing a lot of physical activity within the next 24 or 48 hours. Instead, we want to use dynamic, kind of slow and controlled movements in and out of positions to stretch the same types of tissues. That gets them ready for movement, but doesn't give us those negative neurological components that can put us at risk for injury. Other things that you really should be considering as part of your warm-up and cool-down would be self-tissue mobilization. We touched on that a little bit last week. We'll be touching on it a lot more in upcoming weeks. You also want to make sure that you're getting the tissues themselves warm with a little bit of getting your heart rate up. So doing a light jog before you break into full speed work, or doing some fast walking before you actually jump into that jog. You want to do that in order: soft tissue, dynamic motion, and then warming up the tissues in that order for warm up. You want to reverse it for cool down. So you're going to do kind of slower, less motion to start the cool down. Then you're going to do your dynamic motion. Then you're going to do your soft tissue recovery. So it's just the reverse between warm up and cool down. There's some additional stuff that you can add in that would be a little bit more specialized, but I hope this gives you a little bit of an overview and gives you some tips to stay healthy as you come into that marathon season. Feel free to check us out every Friday. Next week we will be at a different scheduled time. We will post what that is as soon as we have our schedule. I'll be at a seminar and I'll be kind of touching on what that seminar is about and what I'm learning. So thanks for joining us. Check out our website, millerswc.com, for more info, and I'll see you next week.